Welcome to Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone. This is a book summary and analysis of Cooperation and Coercion, How Busybodies Became Busy Bullies, and What That Means for Economics and Politics by Anthony Davies and James R. Harrigan, the hosts of the Words and Numbers podcast. The thesis of the book is that there are two ways to achieve your ends. One is through cooperation, which is when something is done voluntarily and it requires the consent of all parties. The other method of achieving your ends in life is through coercion, which is the use of violence or threat thereof. What makes government a unique institution is that it claims the right to initiate violence against peaceful people. So if I wrote down on a sheet of paper, everyone has to give me their money, no one would respect that as legitimate. But when Franklin Roosevelt writes down, give me all your gold, and it's called an executive order, and people imagine that they have the duty to obey that. If I engage in murder, it's seen as something evil that I should go to jail for. But when a drone program by the military kills 90% civilians who are not even the target, well, that's just foreign policy and collateral damage, and it's important that you pledge your allegiance to those actions. So we have a blatant double standard that the book really gets at the heart of. This is an idea that goes back quite a while. If we look at the economist Henry Hazlitt, he says, the private sector of the economy is in fact the voluntary sector, and the public sector is in fact the coercive sector. In other words, the private sector cannot take a dime out of your pocket unless you voluntarily choose to give it to them because of a product or service. If you end up not liking it, well, you can stop funding them. The public sector, however, does not allow you to opt out of funding things, or very often it doesn't even allow you to compete unless you get some sort of permission by the monarch or permission by the state or the feudal lord. Back to the book. On page 12, he says, here, the difference between government and society is laid bare. Government is a coercive tool society employs to achieve certain ends. Society, on the other hand, is the aggregation of people themselves and is generally cooperative. The book then goes on to talk about two different types of government. One is democracy, the other being dictatorship. Now, the principal difference between these two, the actual difference between these two is not necessarily a principled difference. What we have here is simply a number of people to require who decides whether or not force should be used, or coercion or violence should be used, and how to coerce. This is not necessarily a principled difference. For example, if I said, well, a great deal of people have benefited from Mises.org, the Mises Institute, therefore, because many people benefit, they have the obligation and are morally justified to force people funding them. Well, just because a large number of people benefit or a large number of people are involved does not justify this institution or organization using violence to achieve their ends. So what the average person might say is, well, opposing government means you're against society. And look, we live in a society. Society has rules, therefore you have to abide by what the state says. They quote Aristotle saying that man is a social animal, so human beings have to live with one another in peace to be fully human, to be happy. So the idea that, well, we live in a society, so stop complaining about the state, well, that could be used exactly in the opposite direction. Look, we live in a society. Don't be justifying a group called government taking money by force, caging people for victimless crimes. We live in a society, for heaven's sake. We can't have one group that's held to a totally different standard. So this is an illegitimate criticism of the freedom ideology of libertarianism. It's often said democracy, two wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner. Liberty is a well-armed lamb contesting the vote. They go on to discuss we've discussed a principled moral difference between cooperation and coercion. The authors then talk about an economic difference, or a utilitarian difference, that we could greatly appreciate, which could be referred to as a correcting mechanism that cooperation and free markets have, that the state really does not have. And this correcting mechanism is the ability to opt out of funding things. So even though it's very sad to see places like borders close, it's terrible, but that is a correcting mechanism that is basically a large number of people, society, telling an organization, we don't necessarily value the goods and services at the moment of what you're producing at the price you're producing it. Very sad to see Blockbuster go, but Blockbuster is not something inherently built into nature that human beings need. If people want something else, they voluntarily fund something else. Circuit City is another example of something going out of business, this being a correcting mechanism. A more principled difference is Kim Kardashian getting held up in Paris and her ring getting stolen. And what she did was she fired her security team. Obviously, when something like that happens, the first thing you do is fire the people who said that they would be protecting you. However, if we look at the examples of 9/11, it's not like government got fired or government got their salaries cut in half because they didn't keep us safe. To the contrary, their budgets increased, and the president, who's the head of the security government, his approval rating went up to about 90%, just something, a totally outrageous thing that we also could see in the case of Eric Garner. The police basically jump on top of this man and suffocate him to death, even though he's screaming he can't breathe, for the crime of selling cigarettes, his own property, without permission from the ruling class called government. They're basically a mafia. They say, give us a cut of your business, or you have to get our permission to sell things. If not, we put you in a cage. If you resist the cage, well, then we'll basically murder you. We will shoot you if you resist our employees. Totally unjustified. The market has a utilitarian self-correcting mechanism that the state does not, so even it's not just a morally justified position that the authors have, it's also a utilitarian, more beneficial position. The authors say when governments limit its force to preventing people from harming one another, people have maximum ability to cooperate. So when you say, well, people should be free, well, freedom to do what? Murder, rape, steal? The answer is no, because what that does is that initiates aggression against other peaceful people. So what you would want is a society which says that no person or group of people have the right to initiate force or fraud, because both of those violate the consent of individual human beings. Believing in governance is also not the same as believing in a state. You could have private security, private courts that simply specialize in certain areas. In no way would they have extra rights than any other person or group of people, just as doctors don't have any special rights, or historians don't have any special rights, but they're often delegated to as people who should be seen as having a little more influence in what we should think about brain surgery, or how we should look at, what happened in the First World War. They go on to discuss the knowledge problem, saying, for all that we know collectively, each one of us, even the smartest of us, actually doesn't know much. The example they use is a pencil. So even something as simple, you don't even have to go to, an iPad that's extremely complex. Something as simple as a pencil. How do you make the wood that goes into the pencil? Well, people first have to drive to the forest. Okay, well, in order to do that, you need a car. How do you make a car? How do you make an engine? How do you make the tires? How do you make machines that put air into tires that allow you to drive to the woods to chop down the trees that end up making the pencil? This is an extremely interconnected web of interaction in the method of cooperation that we seldom appreciate. Another idea that they put forward is the idea that we're constantly cooperating. So even though we might think of don't do something by yourself, include society, or no man makes it on his own, therefore the state has, the right to take your half of your income by threat of force. Well, that also means that people in government just happen to be there. They don't have any extra rights. They just happen to live in a place where they happen to get elected. So when it comes to people doing things on their own, we actually do nothing on our own. If you think about it, even the game of solitaire, the person playing solitaire didn't invent the electricity. He's playing on his computer. He didn't invent the game. He didn't invent cards. He didn't invent the mouse. He didn't invent the Wi-Fi connection. The people are constantly trading. Another principle is, are you violently sure? In other words, you might think certain people are not getting a good deal, or something is not being produced at a good price, or it's not being produced in the right way, but just because you think that, it doesn't therefore follow that it's morally justified for the state to coercively intervene in that voluntary interaction. So unless you are violently sure that someone is acting unjustly, you have no justification for involving the state. They go in to discuss the rights and wrongs of interaction, and basically people's understanding of what a right is has changed, and this is reflected in how the state has grown. So we have two sorts of rights: positive rights, which is the freedom to something, the right to an education, the right to healthcare, the right to a house, to food, etc. And then we have competing with that is negative rights, which is basically freedom from aggression. In other words, I can do anything so long as I don't initiate fraud or aggression against peaceful people. The authors say the shift in our conception of rights has led to a virtually limitless federal government. They say your rights should be seen as my obligations or duties. So if you have a right to not be aggressed against, I have an obligation to not aggress against you. If you have a right to health care, well, then that means I have a right to provide you with health care. If I don't, then I'm violating your rights. This is a fundamental difference we could see between Bernie Sanders and Rand Paul. Bernie Sanders saying, I believe that health care is a right regardless of income, that every American has the right to the best quality health care that the system can offer. Rand Paul responds, with regard to the idea of whether or not you have a right to health care, you have to realize what that implies. I'm a physician. That means you have the right to come to my house and conscript me. It means you believe in slavery. This means you're going to enslave not only me, but the janitor at my hospital, the assistants, the nurses. There's an implied threat of force. Do you have a right to beat down my door with the police, escort me away, and force me to take care of you? That's ultimately what the right to free health care would be. We can clearly see this in people's belief that they have a right to forcibly stop people from interacting in voluntary exchanges under the guise of regulating them, which is just coercively intervening. We see a drastic increase in the national debt, not only as a percentage of GDP, but also overall. The final nail in the coffin of the positive rights philosophy could be described by the author Larkin Rose. He says a simple analogy makes all liberal political theory collapse. If 100 people were shipwrecked on an island, what would it even mean to say that everyone there has a right to food, or everyone has a right to healthcare, or a right to a job, or a right to a living wage? If, for example, someone has a right to housing, and housing comes only from the knowledge, skills, and efforts of other people, it means that one person has the right to force another person to build him a house. This is exactly what happens in a larger context when liberals advocate that some people be forcibly robbed via taxation in order to provide benefits for others. The notion that people, by virtue of their mere existence, are entitled to all sorts of things which come only into being as a result of human knowledge and effort, is delusional. The logical result of this supposedly loving and compassionate viewpoint is violence and slavery, because if one's need entitles him to something, that means that it must be forcibly taken from anyone else who has it or can produce it if he will not willingly supply it. The authors go on to discuss the magic wand, where they make three general points. They say the same shortcomings you have when it comes to the marketplace also exist when the state gets involved. So people will say, well, in the market, look, people are imperfect and they're imperfect and they don't have perfect knowledge. I'm sorry, do politicians have perfect knowledge? Do voters have perfect knowledge? But there's corruption in the free market. Are government officials not corrupt? Well, if there's no government, people might die. Do people die as the result of government wars and the FDA? Of course, this is just ridiculous. So every time you have a criticism of voluntary interaction, it's important you also take that criticism and apply it also to the state. The authors say what people imagine will happen and what actually happens when we ask government to fix a problem are rarely, if ever, the same thing. So two examples we could use are the drastic increase since the 1960s in educational spending per student adjusted for inflation, and it's not like people are brilliant today and they were stupid way back then. Another example is a increase in the minimum wage. Just increasing the minimum wage doesn't make people's wages go up necessarily. If you totally lose your job, well, then you go from $5 an hour to $0 an hour, and you get no on-the-job skills, and it hurts future employment opportunities. Fewer organizations can open up and compete with bigger shops who are able to afford an increase in the minimum wage, which gives employees less options, which gives consumers less options, which increases the price. So, I mean, if you advocate the minimum wage, you're just advocating for serfdom and violence against peaceful people. That's just not a virtuous thing to do. They then discuss dispersed cost and concentrated benefits. So, well, it takes a lot of effort for me to take days off of work, go down to the Capitol, and try to convince politicians to not give more money to certain special interest groups. I'm one person. That's going to take a lot of my time, and it's unlikely that I benefit. But if you're Boeing or Raytheon or Tyson farmers who get a lot of money through farm subsidies, well, then it makes a lot of sense financially for you to spend a lot of time lobbying Congress for subsidies and regulations that stomp out competition. So it only costs me like $5 a year for farm subsidies, but for the farmers themselves, well, it's literally billions of dollars. So that is another example of why the state continues to grow, because some people have a big incentive to make the law happen, and everyone else has very little incentive to repeal the laws. That's why more and more get passed. The book ends with discussing why we have what could be referred to as busy bullies. So whereas you might have someone saying, hey, what's going on over there? I'm going to make this my business. That might be annoying. But when you have the belief in statism, you actually get people calling on the phone saying, I don't think these people have a license to be here. They don't have the Crown's permission. Therefore, I need a police officer down here immediately. We also have the same thing with this lemonade stand. This in the bottom left, we have a video of the police forcibly stopping people engaging in voluntary exchanges because they don't have permission from the mass murdering government to sell lemonade, as if they have any right to forcibly stop people from trading goods and services. You don't have the right to force your economic beliefs any more than people have the right to force their religious beliefs on you. So for the same reason we should have separation of church and state, we should have separation of economy and state. The conclusion is that there really is only one crime that we need to be vigilantly opposed to, and this is the violation of consent. It's the principled justification for cooperation. It is the difference between sex and rape, a job and slavery, a transaction and robbery. This is the difference between civilization and barbarism. It can really be shown in this image right here, that a voluntary exchange, represented through a handshake or an offer, is superior morally and economically than initiating violence. It in no way means everything is perfect if done on a voluntary basis. No, it's simply saying that it's morally superior. So believing that in voluntary marriage doesn't mean all marriages are perfect. It's just saying voluntary marriages are morally superior to coercive marriage. The same thing applies to the economic sphere. I absolutely recommend the book Cooperation and Coercion. Thank you for watching. Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone.